It is just such a pleasure to have you here. Very happy that you're here to speak, and I'm sorry we only have this moment over lunch, but we do have this time for you to address us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Diana. And thank you also to Hitesh. Yes, thanks very much. And I hate to tell you, Hitesh, but I did actually have to look up that quote you sent me. I did actually have to look it up and check who it was, and it was Verlaine. So when I responded to you, I made it sound as though I knew it was Verlaine all along, but of course I didn't. Anyway, it's a great honor to be here at Harvard and the Mittal Institute. And this is clearly one of the most important issues in the world today, notwithstanding all the wars and the crises that are afflicting the world. That issue that we're talking about is important, and it's the state of our rivers. As a journalist, I'm not going to shy away from describing the dire state of affairs that confronts, many of our rivers, though I will try to avoid spoiling your lunch by going into too much gruesome detail about the kinds of pollution to which the Ganges is subjected. But I also, as Diana said, I have a message of hope at the end about how we can help rivers and restore them. And it is actually quite, it's surprisingly hard to make oneself heard when talking about these existential ecological issues. Around the time I was writing my book a few years ago, River of Life, the book up there, the novelist Amitav Ghosh took a break from his wonderful fiction, much of it is actually set in the Ganges watershed, to publish a non-fiction work which was called Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable. And it was an attempt to understand something puzzling. How come climate change, which is an unfolding disaster more important even than some of the world wars that have inspired previous generations of novelists and poets, how come this disaster was not finding a proper place in art and literature? Of course, there have been a few science fiction films and books about our dystopian or a dystopian post-apocalyptic world, often involving attempts by humanity to flee to distant planets. But Ghosh was making what I think is a really important observation. It's almost as though climate change is too embarrassing to cover because it's so spectacularly awful. And it goes beyond the personal, emotional preoccupations of the typical fictional protagonist. But it's not just fiction. I mean, even non-fiction writers can have a tough time getting the message across. How many of us, even those who see ourselves as committed environmentalists, we guiltily switch off when we hear or see or read another piece about bad news about melting glaciers, rising temperatures, and extreme weather events. Sometimes it all seems a bit too much to bear. So I'd like to think that my book gets around the problem, or tries to get around the problem, by taking a dual approach. Truth-telling on the one hand about the environmental catastrophe that is definitely hitting the Ganges, but also offering some solutions on the other hand. And the life and death title of the book of course, embodies that sort of ecological duality of the river as a life giver that's also dangerous to human life because of the pollution. But it also refers to the religious importance of the river in the cycle of life, death, and rebirth for Hindus, something on which the Sanskrit scholar Diana Ek here is, from the Institute, is of course an expert, and much more of an expert than me. The river's religious and social importance and environmental importance stretches far beyond the Gangetic plain. I think because the rich silt, and we've heard a bit about the silt of its waters that are in the waters that are brought down from the Himalayas, has fed and enriched a tenth of humanity almost since the dawn of time, dawn of history anyway. For millennia, the Gangetic plain has been one of the wealthiest and most densely populated zones on Earth, which is why the Mughals from Central Asia and the British traders of the East India Company found India such an attractive country to invade, to occupy, and to pillage, as our previous speaker was explaining. And the Ganges has always been worshipped as a life giver, not merely by these invaders, but also, of course, by the farmers and fishermen who live on its shifting banks of sand and mud. And the river, in the words of Diana Ek again, is the archetype of sacred waters, spiritually present in all kinds of waterways, ponds and wells across South Asia and beyond, including there's a little well in England where Maharaja put some, built a well. It's called the Maharaja's Well because he was helping a friend and there was a drought in that part of England, in the Chilterns. I wrote about the river not only because it's the world's most important waterway, given the hundreds of millions of people who depend on it and live in the watershed, but also because of its remarkable place in Indian and global history and mythology, right down to the way its environmental and religious significance is presented even in Bollywood movies, most famously Ram Teri Ganga Maili, which means, I don't know if you've seen that movie, but it's a wonderful movie. It means Ram, the god Ram, your Ganga is sullied. It also has great music, and I urge you to watch it if you haven't seen it. It's a sort of allegorical tale about the goddess Ganga and how she's being defiled. And actually, speaking of music, I can't resist a little anecdote about the Baul musicians I heard at Sagar Island, where one of the ceremonies takes place every year for the Ganga, as Diana, I think, mentioned last night. And I went there one year to watch and report on what was going on. And you have these Baul musicians, orange-robed minstrels, traditional minstrels of Bengal, and they were singing this extraordinarily haunting melody in Bengali to the sound of an ektara, which is a one-stringed instrument made from a gourd. And the audience was sitting there absolutely mesmerized, and so was I. It sounded absolutely beautiful. So I turned to my Bengali-speaking colleague, and I said to her, "What are they singing?" And she whispered to me that it was a message from the organizers of the festival. Use the toilet and wash your hands afterwards. The goddess will be angry if you despoil her. And I thought, well, there's a lesson there somewhere. But ultimately, I chose the subject, or maybe the subject chose me precisely because it's a vehicle. The river Ganga, in particular, is a vehicle for so many of the environmental subjects that concern us today. And of course, I love rivers from the Rother near my home in Kent, which my brother Jim, who's also a professor at Harvard, he knows about that as well. And I walked the length of this little river when I was writing the book. But also I've loved the Nile, where I lived as a child in Khartoum, and the Amazon, and of course the Ganges. I first went to live in India in 2012, although it wasn't my first visit. And even then it was obvious that these environmental issues, including climate change, were becoming ever more prominent. And Diana's described the moment at which I kind of became aware of this when I went to this little sailing club on the Yamuna in Okhla. And as I noted at the time, the Yamuna River, one of the great tributaries of the Ganges, is portrayed in India's legends and paintings and remembered in its histories as a paradise of lilies, turtles, and fish. On its banks, the cheerful god Krishna would play his flute amid a troop of adoring gopis. And now, of course, Krishna would really have to think twice before doing anything of that kind near Okhla, where the raw sewage and the industrial waste from Greater Delhi's 25 million inhabitants is flowing in the river. And I think as somebody, I think the Harsh from the World Bank, I think was mentioning this earlier, it's so polluted that it contains nearly 500,000 times the maximum level of fecal bacteria that are established as the Indian standard for bathing water, not for drinking water, but for bathing water. So it's just catastrophically off the charts. So right there, you see the problem for people like me. You start writing about a river, its history, its religious, ecological significance, and the beautiful art it has inspired, and very quickly you end up talking about sewage. It's important. It's probably the most important thing for human health and well-being after food and drink, but it's still off-putting and hard to write about and to read about and to hear about, especially during lunch. I'm really sorry to say that things have not improved much since I wrote the book some years ago. The UN's called the Ganges woefully polluted. Repeated government programs to clean up the river under Narendra Modi's administrations and his predecessors have been announced, they've been funded, but they've made only very, very little headway in actually tackling the problems. Now, there are other, it's not just sewage, there are other environmental crises connected with the river. I reached the source of the Ganges, the Ganga at Gomukh in late 2013, following the so-called Himalayan tsunami, which Diana mentioned again last night. These were the floods that swept down the Alaknanda and Bhagirathi rivers and killed more than 5,000 people, many of them pilgrims. And actually, just by the way, that was hardly reported in the outside world at all. A massive disaster that killed 5,000 people, and it was barely mentioned in the international media. And this kind of disaster, where monsoon rainfall is more extreme, precipitation comes as rain rather than snow, even at high altitudes, it's one of the inevitable effects of global warming, and these kind of incidents are becoming more frequent. And paradoxically, again, as we've heard earlier today, climate change contributes to droughts as well as floods, and I wrote about that as well, and the shortage of water in places such as the Bundelkhand. And then there are other kinds of pollution, heavy metals, which again we've heard about, other toxins released by factories, plastic waste, and an unexpected problem, which I don't think we've talked about today, but which I have a chapter on in my book, is the alarming presence of antibiotic-resistant bacteria in the river. Then there's a problem of which infects people and which they then pass on through the river. It's a problem of overpopulation, relentless pressure on natural resources, including the river dolphins, the gharials, the fish, on which so many people depend, and the threatened mangrove swamps and the Sundarbans at the mouth of the river. The mouth of the river, or the mouths of the river, I should say, in India and Bangladesh. This extraordinary landscape frequented by man-eating tigers and an extraordinary community of fisher people and farmers and honey collectors, all wonderfully described by Amitav Ghosh in his novel, this time, The Hungry Tide. Now, it's understandable that all this is a bit depressing, because it is depressing, and we've heard today how difficult it is to get anything done that is valuable in saving the river. But there is good news out there. There are solutions. There are things we can do to save the river and to save the planet. One of my chapters is called How to Build a Megacity and Save the Ganges. And it was based on my experiences at the 2013 Kumbh Mela, one of the biggest ever, I think, in Allahabad as it then was. It is now Prayag in 2013. And this festival has always been extraordinarily well organized by the Indian authorities and the Uttar Pradesh authorities. And this seems surprising when you think how bad these authorities often are at organizing other things. And it was studied, that Kumbh Mela was studied by this very institute, and you produced a book about it, which was called Kumbh Mela Mapping the Ephemeral Megacity, which featured multidisciplinary research of the kind you're doing now on rivers more generally from this institute. And I was there, I think, when it was launched in Mumbai in 2016, but I believe it came out here a year or two earlier. And just to describe briefly what this megacity does, in a matter of weeks on these very shifting sandbanks at the confluence of the Yamuna and the Ganga and the invisible Saraswati, 100,000 workers built 14 clinics and hospitals. They installed 960 kilometers of power lines, 25,000 street lights, electricity substations, connections, roads, safe bathing space along the riverbank, pontoon bridges, 690 kilometers of water pipes, 34,000 toilets, 20,000 police officers, 1,000 anti-terrorist agents, food shops, clinics, etc. And these extraordinary achievements, which happen every time there's a Kumbh Mela, they just raise this question, how and why, or rather, how is it that something which can be done for this temporary festival cannot be done for permanent villages and towns across North India? Why can't we have efficient infrastructure and waste treatment all the time? Why does it have to only be when there's a festival? And it's not just Uttar Pradesh. The same thing happens at Sagar Island, as you heard those minstrels singing about. That was set up by the authorities, and Sagar Island's festival is also very well organized, and they take great care not to cause too much pollution. Narendra Modi, in 2014, when he was campaigning to become Prime Minister, he chose Benares, Varanasi, as his parliamentary constituency that he would contest in the election, and of course he went on to win it. He told the crowds in Varanasi, when I was coming to this city, I thought it was the BJP that was sending me, the ruling party of India. But after I came here, I felt Mother Ganges had called me. I felt like a child coming to his mother. I want Kashi, that is Varanasi, to be the spiritual capital of the world. And then after his election triumph, he didn't forget the river. He came back shortly afterwards and said, "Ma Ganga has decided some responsibilities for me." I was there when he told this to a big crowd of celebrations by the river. "She will keep guiding me, and I shall fulfill the tasks one by one. From her source to her end, Ma Ganga is screaming for help. She is saying, there must be one of my sons who will come and pull me out of this filth." This is Modi speaking, right? And then he said, "There are many tasks that perhaps God has set for me." And the results, unfortunately, of the cleanup campaigns that he launched, on top of the ones that had gone previously, are mixed at best. But his focus on the river, his talking about the river, it does bring us to this question that we grappled with a little bit in our discussions last night. It's like, why do people pollute the very river that they worship? One of the people I met during my travels was B.D. Tripathi, who was, I don't know if he still is, head of environmental science at Banaras Hindu University, who had been concerned about the Ganges for a very long time, since 1972. He bathed with his mother, and he encountered the floating corpse of a cow. And then, of course, that made him start thinking about pollution and the need to start measuring the pollution and dealing with it. And his mother was furious. She said, she said, "You're not a Hindu if you talk about this kind of thing. The water of Ganga is the most pure." So again, we come back to this issue of people cannot accept that the water is dirty, even when it is, because it's spiritually pure. Therefore, it cannot be, the physical dirt cannot be a problem. So, I mean, like many concerned Indians, I realized that this was a sort of conundrum, a dilemma that had to be sorted out. People managed to separate the actual physical filth of the river from its eternal spiritual purity, and they pretend that the physical world does not and cannot impinge on the spiritual one. But in fact, it's my view and the view of sensible gurus along the river, as you'll hear shortly, that it's precisely because the Ganges is so important in its physical form of life-giving water, fertile silt, and so on, for so many of the world's people, that it came to be worshipped in the first place as a spirit of nature, and finally as a fully fledged goddess of the Hindu pantheon. That's why many rivers in ancient Britain and France, as well as in India, and their river confluences in particular, are worshipped or have been worshipped in the past. And of course, those traditions continue in India, and they've died out in many other places. David Haberman, when he was researching his book on the Yamuna, he encounters this rather thoughtful holy man near the river in Vrindavan and asks him whether the goddess can survive even if the river itself is destroyed. And the holy man immediately calls this foolish. He says, "If you destroy the river, Yamunaji is finished. The river is the real goddess, not some lady sitting on a turtle." I love that quote. He said, this is the holy man speaking. He says, "That is just a symbol. The river is the main thing, the main form of Yamuna. Those people who say the physical river is not important are foolish people. They are the ones shitting in the river." Sorry for the bad language, but that's what he said. They don't know what life is, what this world is. And lastly, just on this issue of the kind of the dilemma over spiritual and physical purity, it's ironic that the reason that the Yamuna is relatively clean by the time it reaches the mainstream of the Ganga at Prayag is precisely because it has been filled by the waters of the Chambal River. And this is a river that is accursed for Hindus for reasons which I explain in my book, and therefore has been mostly left alone and has no temples along it, and it now has a thriving nature reserve, and it's become this source of clean water for the whole Ganga river system, precisely because it has been ignored by large numbers of people. I want to have a time for questions, so I won't go on too long. But I just want to bring us on to the sort of the positive messages that I thought I could bring here, the solutions, if you like. One of the final chapters of the book is called "Mission Impossible ? How to Clean the Ganges," and I use the example of the examples of other major rivers around the world that were notoriously filthy and polluted, and I explain what it took to rescue them. And the point here is that we should not despair about the Ganga, because we've all been there in the West, in the developed world, and we've had disastrously polluted and dead rivers, and we've cleaned them up and saved them in most cases. One of them is the Chicago River, which was interestingly discussed among other environmental issues such as climate change by Modi when he was first Prime Minister with Obama. They met at the White House in 2014, and Obama told Modi that the river in his native Chicago was once so filthy that it used to catch fire, but was now a place where fish could be caught and eaten. And Modi told Obama, that's exactly what I want for the Ganga. So I think we all know that progress on cleaning the Ganga, or rather ending pollution of the Ganga has been disappointingly slow, but the example of these other rivers shows it's not an impossible task. And another river that I used as an example was the Rhine, which runs through or along 6 countries in Western Europe. Pollution there peaked in the 1960s and 70s, so relatively recently in historical terms, and took billions of dollars to rectify, mainly through the building of sewage plants, which is what India is doing to some extent and should be doing more of, and controls on industrial effluents. But as with the Ganga or any other river near centers of population, this dirt, this filth, was not a new phenomenon. It was so bad even 200 years ago that Samuel Taylor Coleridge even wrote a light-hearted poem about it called Cologne. I don't know if any of you know this Coleridge poem, but it's a very relevant poem for rivers. So I'll read it very quickly. In Köln, that's Cologne, a town of monks and bones, and pavements fanged with murderous stones, and rags and hags and hideous wenches, I counted 72 stenches, all well defined, and several stinks. Ye nymphs that reign o'er sewers and sinks, the river Rhine, it is well known, doth wash your city of Cologne. But tell me, nymphs, what power divine shall henceforth wash the river Rhine? So that was Coleridge. And lastly, I'll come to the Thames. On arriving in India and being told about the state of the Yamuna, or seeing the state of the Yamuna, I was immediately transported to my childhood in London in the 1960s. School kids such as myself were told by our mothers not to fall in the river or drink the water because it was so poisonous and polluted that we would have to have our stomachs pumped. And the Thames, in fact, has been polluted by human waste and effluent and corpses even before the Industrial Revolution. Back in 1357, King Edward II complained about filth on the riverbanks and the fumes and other abominable stenches arising therefrom, while friars complained that some of their brethren were being killed by putrid exhalations of the river. And repeated efforts were made to clean the river. And the Victorians finally did it in the 19th century by installing sewage treatment plants for the first time, and so on, about around the same time as they built the first London metro lines, the tube lines. But pollution returned. The river was again dead by the time the Second World War had ended and the 1960s rolled around. But now it's alive again, as is the Seine in Paris, where I'm living now. Last summer, we went swimming frequently in the Seine because for the Olympics in 2024, the Paris government had cleaned up the river, and now you can swim in the Seine, and it's a beautiful experience. So the point here is that Indian rivers are not uniquely filthy or unhealthy, although the pollution they can contain is a danger to more people. But that's just because more people depend on the water of the Ganges and its tributaries, and on the vegetables that are grown in its silt and the fish that it produces. Yeah, so I think I can move on now. So I think I'll draw it to a close, and we can and I'd be delighted to hear any questions you may have. In the book I do quote ancient Greek, Chinese, Muslim explorers and travelers who first described the Ganges, starting more than 2 millennia ago, including Ralph Fitch, who is an emissary of Queen Elizabeth I in the time of Shakespeare, who famously said, "Here is a great store of fish of sundry sorts and wild fowls, swans, geese, cranes, and many other things. The country is very fruitful and populous. In this river of Ganges are many islands. His water is very sweet and pleasant." But I want to end by quoting from that film I mentioned. I just had this idea when I was looking at this chapter just now, because it's just such a wonderful. This is the title the title song from Ram Ganga Teri Maili. And the music and lyrics are by Ravindra Jain. And I won't read the whole thing because it's quite a long song, but I urge you to actually listen to it and watch the film because it's well worth it. And this is the bulk of the song. Listen to the words of Ganga, all those who come to my banks. They used to live by the rule that once a promise is made, it must be fulfilled at the cost of one's life. Our river Ganga, our Ganga weeps as she cries out, "Oh Ram, your Ganga has been sullied, washing away the sins of the sinners. Oh Ram, your Ganga has been sullied, washing away the sins of the sinners." And it ends on these lines: the land and the river Ganga are the same, but her people have changed. Their hands are stained with blood. Their faces are glowing, but their hearts are dark. They forget their vows and make false promises. Their morals are low, but they walk with their heads held high. These sinners cannot be purified even by the Ganga's holy water. O Ram, your Ganga has been sullied, washing away the sins of the sinners. So thank you very much indeed. And I'm happy to take any questions. I think we've got maybe 15 or 20 minutes, as much as people want, I think. We haven't gone over time, have we? No. Yep.
Victor, while people are, oh, you have one, great. While people are thinking of questions, I'm also saying the Charles River, which we're just next to, oh yeah.
I was going to ask about that.
Yes. Super dirty and since 85, cleaned.
Any hope at all? If you put Tarun, you and Rahul on charge, Modi says go ahead. Step 1, step 2, step 3.
You mean what should we actually do?
Yeah, actually do.
Yeah, I think. I'm interested to hear about the Charles River. Who knows about the Charles River? So you're saying it's got cleaner?
There's a Charles River initiative and conservancy, which was private, state, and also federal governments acting together.
Yeah.
Sorry? Maybe Dukakis, I'm forgetting. It started in the 80s.
Yeah. So in London, there's a problem that the river was cleaned up and now it's got dirty again recently because, I mean, it's still relatively clean compared to historical times, but the privatized water companies have been guilty of discharging masses of sewage into British English rivers, which is a huge problem. But in a very brief answer to your question, what I would say is that I think, especially in a country like India, the government has to be involved because it has the money and the power to enforce things, but it has to actually do it rather than talk about it. There's a section in my book where I talk about sanitation, and there are all these wonderful sanitation numbers came out from, I think it was the Uttar Pradesh government talking about how many toilets they built and how wonderful that was. And then somebody did, I think it was one of the NGOs did an actual survey of what had actually happened. So every year, the state government was reporting better and better sanitation and more toilets. But the reality, when 10 years later, after 10 years of this very expensive program, one of the NGOs did a survey on the ground, and they discovered that not a single toilet had been built. So the whole thing was basically a lie. I mean, in net terms, the situation was no better than it was 10 years earlier. So essentially, all this money had been stolen or wasted. Not a single thing had been done. So on the one hand, yeah, step 1 is the government has to be involved. Step 2 is the government actually has to do it properly. And then, of course, you need the support of... I think people do support initiatives when they know that they're actually leading to something. The problem is despair. You look at Varanasi, again and again, governments have announced things, and there are sewage treatment pumps, and but then you go along and you visit the treatment pump, the government tells you this treatment pump is working wonderfully, and then it's obviously it hasn't been used for 5 years. So
there are garbage cans on the docks now.
yeah. No, that was and of course some people would say this is a superficial thing and that you actually need to deal with a big infrastructural problem. Yeah.
That's about the only change I've seen.
Just a comment on the Thames.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the issues, my understanding is, this is the speaking as a business school person, it's business run amok, right? Because you look at the amount of money that the privatized under Thatcher. So this was the end of Thatcher's era, late 80s maybe. That the water authorities were privatized, but in a very light touch way, sort of like what Mr. Trump is doing here now with the EPA. And that just meant that the companies started to, instead of continuing to maintain effluent plants, they just dividended out all the money to their shareholders.
I mean, that's the point, isn't it? Is that the
it's all the money's
profits,
just
the
gone
profits
out,
were not reinvested in the future. They were simply handed out as dividends.
So I mean, I think the lesson I took away from that episode is that it's not. I wouldn't agree with you that the government in India should do it. It should architect and steward it.
Yeah.
Because our track record with the government actually delivering things.
Yeah.
It's pretty dismal.
Yeah, but then the private sector is also not very good.
Right, so you need
maybe what
the
you need
boundary
is
conditions,
I think what you're saying is you need the private sector to do it under a very fierce
Precisely,
government control. Yeah, yeah.
And I should mention Massachusetts, Tarun, I don't know when you moved here. I moved here to study in the late 70s, and since then I've seen one great example of private sector, public sector collaboration. I don't know what we call it. But the judiciary intervened here and cleaned up the harbor. So that's one good example. And I go back to Bangladesh once in a while and ask, can we copy that model? Well, as you know, in developing countries, there are lots of problems. Yeah. The judiciary cannot force the government and the private sector to do what we have done here in Massachusetts.
No, the judiciary has often intervened on river pollution in India, and it's ordered things to be done, and they haven't been done.
Oh, I'm Abdul Shibli. I spent the rest of my life here. I grew up here, moved to Boston. I worked at Harvard and the World Bank, and now I am a syndicated columnist.
One interesting example to look at, and again, I think we mentioned this briefly last night, is the tanneries in Kanpur, it's a very political issue because most of the owners of the tanneries are Muslims, so it's easy for the government to say, oh, you know, this is all the fault of the Muslims who are dirtying our holy river. Of course, it's much more complicated than that, but the example of Kanpur and the tanneries is really interesting because there have been some successful moves to control the pollution, but not enough and not totally. A lot of this was funded by foreign donors, which is fine. And for a while, there was actually a successful partial program to purify the wastewaters that were going into the Ganges and filling the Ganges with heavy metals. I don't know what the very latest is, but it's worth looking at the history of those initiatives and how they've been partially successful and then not successful. And one of the problems is that the government would not, in fact, one of the things I mentioned in my book, I recall that one of the, I think again this is the state government, but they had emergency pumps for when the electricity failed, which it often did at that time. So the pumps for pushing the wastewater to the treatment center would still work. Because they had diesel generators. And of course, what happened is somebody stole all the fuel for the diesel generators. So when the power went off, which it frequently did, the wastewater just went straight into the Ganges. And this is just an example of petty corruption. Somebody steals the diesel, sells it or whatever, and then there's no way of pumping the water when there's a power cut. And this is the kind of issue where you need everybody involved. You need the private sector involved. Some of the tannery owners were very keen on getting this done because they knew it was very bad for their reputations. They had to sell their products on international markets, and if they were seen to be a polluting industry, that wasn't going to be easy. So the private sector was keen in most cases. Certainly the bigger companies were keen because they were exporting as well as selling to India. The government was keen, foreign donors were keen, and it's just a matter of bringing it all together, but making sure, I think, again, this is where you need a powerful government that regulates its industries and regulates, the people who are doing all this and then getting it going. So the Kanpur story is a sort of partial success. And just one last thing about that. I remember one of the tannery owners saying to me, it's easy to blame us, the tannery owners, because we're Muslims, but actually we're not the only businesses in Kanpur that are polluting the river. And he's right. There's something like, there's hundreds and hundreds of factories in Kanpur. Not all of them, many of them are not tanneries. Obviously, most of them are not tanneries. And those factories have not even been looked at. So while the focus is rightly on the tanneries because their type of pollution is particularly toxic with heavy metal pollution, it's also true that they were an easy scapegoat for especially a Hindu nationalist government to deal with. Yeah.
I'm Jack Hawley from
New York someplace, but I spend regularly a good bit of time in Vrindavan. And so let me just say a word or two about how it seems to me in Vrindavan. And I'm hardly an expert, but I do go regularly.
But you wrote a whole book about Vrindavan, right?
I did do that. And the river comes in, and sewage comes in, and overdevelopment comes in, and lots comes in. We're seeing a complete destruction of the wilderness, the van, that is the basis of Vrindavan, as a matter of fact. But focusing on the river for a moment, let me even not try to speak about the complex of industrial effluents that come into the Ganges above Vrindavan, over which Vrindavan has no control. So it's obviously is the case that the government has to be involved there, but we can just focus on the city itself. It's very hard for a pilgrimage place as pure as Vrindavan to confess that it is also a place where people have bodily functions, and where waste is produced, and where a great deal of waste is produced, especially during tourist periods. So what is easy? What's relatively easy is to build a huge 6-foot by 6-foot diameter pipe that will go from above Vrindavan all the way along the river down to the other side of Vrindavan. And where will that water come out? The Kala Pani, the black water, well, it will come out on the other side of Vrindavan as a gift to Mathura. So, there's a long-standing issue between Vrindavan and Mathura. This is its most recent incarnation. But it doesn't solve many things because, as a matter of fact, the Ganga, the Yamuna is also involved. And when she has a really good monsoon, boy, she has her eye on that pipe, and it's a mess. So if you go to Vrindavan today, you will see various shards of that enormous pipe lining the Yamuna along with all the rest. It didn't succeed. The serious problem, it seems to me, is to create somehow a sense of civic pride that will involve shit, that will mean that people who actually work in the sewage treatment plant, which we now have. We had one before, but it was never used, ever used. It just sat there. Now we have one that's used, and the people who use it are, who man it, are actually from the regional government in UP. They come up from the Lucknow area, and they are, I would guessing by caste names, they are middling caste, and they work hard, but they're not part of the local population.
And does it treat 100% of the wastewater?
It can do 40% on a good day. So that's pretty good, but we obviously need 1 or 2 more. Yeah. And what we really need is a pumping system that will get the sewage up from near the Yamuna, and this will be costly, up into the higher sections of the city so that it can fall down into the sewage plants. And that's a big task. Yeah. So it has to do with who's going to do that. The government has to be behind it, and not just behind these beautification projects like the corridor, which is going to connect Banki Bihari to the river in the same way that you have Kashi Vishwanath in relation to the Ganga. This is hard and very, what shall I say? Well, we have to give the Modi government credit, I think, for actually dealing in toilets. But then, as you were saying, what happens to those toilets? Who cares for them? Who uses them? Who uses them once they've been used? Those are deep problems of social aggregation that are hard to deal with in a place that I know.
Thank you very much. Yeah. No, I mean, I'm really glad to hear that, because a lot of those issues, even to the extent of the pipe that goes, upstream, so that carrying the waste, so that the waste treatment, exactly the same thing has been happening in Varanasi, and there's controversy. They turned on the pump, and then somebody complained that it was leaking, and endless problems like that. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And just the gift that Delhi gives to Agra is, of course, the disgusting water that goes straight down to Agra. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Avia, and I'm studying groundwater at Syracuse University, groundwater depletion in Bangladesh. Yeah. So within South Asian scholarship, on religion and river, and even throughout this symposium so far, there has been quite a bit of discourse on the deification of rivers by the Hindu communities, both in India and Bangladesh. However, I see there is a dearth of literature, almost zero, and a dearth of discourse on the deification and the use of river by Sufi tariqa followers in Bangladesh, and Sufism in Bangladesh is a living, thriving practice that is increasingly being resisted by doctrinalists and textualists. However, rivers continue to be a major mode of transportation for devotees who visit these shrines, who visit like hundreds of shrines dotted across the banks of rivers in Bangladesh. And them being working class, these devotees still use these river networks to reach these dargahs, these shrines, and they have a lot of local cultures, such as singing on a barge of bamboos when they are on their way to these shrines, taking gifts for their peers, many of whom are still living. And even when this Sufi tradition and its relationship to river is invoked within South Asianist literature, it is almost most of the time presented as something that has happened in the past, maybe in the Mughal time or in the British era. However, I would like to underscore that this is, like me being a practitioner, this is a very much a living condition, and this practice cannot operate, particularly in the rural areas, without these river networks. So I was wondering if the deification and the religious invocation of river, particularly the Ganga and its many tributaries in India and across South Asia, has it been studied from the vantage point of living Sufi practitioners? Because we study the Kumbh, but several mini Kumbhs in the form of annual Urus happens in Bangladesh every year. And every year in these Urus, lakhs of devotees gather, and they come to this Urus using these river networks. And it is a living, I'm underscoring again, it's a living, thriving, growing tradition despite the resistance and violent resistance by the doctrinalists in living times. So I was wondering if there is any scope for this aspect to be brought into studies of river within South Asia.
Thank you. That's absolutely fascinating. I think the answer is yes. And in fact, I mean, don't forget that I'm trying to remember which emperor it was. I think it was Akbar who had water transported from miles from the Ganga because he thought the water was pure and blessed, and it was the cleanest and best water and the most holy water he could find. And of course, also a lot of the poets, you know, the Persian-speaking poets and Urdu poets have talk about the river. And in fact, even Modi, I know this is hard to believe today, but when Modi was campaigning for victory in 2014, when he became Prime Minister, he talked a lot about the kind of, I think it was called Ganga Yamni Tehzeeb, the sort of dual culture of not just the Ganga and the Yamna, but Muslim and Hindu culture as well. So this is something that is recognized, but is obviously not recognized enough. And I think, you know, you're absolutely right to point it out. And when I said that other cultures, other than Indian cultures, have worshipped rivers, it's part of the same thing. In other words, these people in ancient Britain who were worshipping river confluences were not Hindus and they were not Muslims. They were, you know, pagan Britons. I don't even know what gods they worship, but they worship river spirits. So yeah, I think there is a lot of scope for not only confining our sort of thoughts about the holiness of the river to Hindus only. Clearly, that's a mistake. I mean, the issue, of course, is that the majority of the population in India are Hindus, but there's an enormous number, as you know, of Muslims, not just in India, but in North India especially, but also in Bangladesh and Pakistan. Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's a really important issue, and I think if if Hindu nationalists could stop demonizing Muslims, they might find ways of cooperating, especially about things like the rivers. Yeah, yeah.
Should we take one last question?
Sure. I think there was somebody over there. Was it? Yeah.
Hi, Iram Sattar. I am a graduate here of the law school, but I want to offer something because we're sitting here in Massachusetts, and there's something called the conservation commissions that are run to protect the wetlands and all water bodies. I have been on the Cambridge Conservation Commission for several years now, and it's a fascinating model. So it's a commission of member-appointed citizens, of the city, who work with the Department of Public Works to try and figure out, because we brought up specifically the Charles, to say what goes into the Charles, who has any input into the Charles, what comes out of the Charles. It is a fascinating process. So maybe there is scope, and there are close to about 400 conservation commissions in Massachusetts. That's a lot, who are looking at all stormwater, anything that has to be built, constructed, that has an impact on the watershed, has to come before the Conservation Commission and get approved. Yeah. And these are extensive hearings. You can be like a big builder, a person who's just trying to do a little house project, whatever. If it touches a watershed, you have to come before the Conservation Commission. Maybe there's a role for that kind of citizen involvement that is structured into like the body politic, and people stand, for these, you get appointed, it's a formal process. We take our work really seriously, and we look at all plans.
That's great. I remember meeting a dentist on the Ramganga in Moradabad, I think it is, who was part of a kind of group that was trying to save the river, And one of the sad things I noticed when I was researching my book was that I was talking to people in all the major, communities along the Ganga, but I realized after a while that the people I was talking to were exactly the same people that people have been talking to 10 years earlier, 20 years earlier, or in the case of Sankat Mochan, it's the son of the guy, and you think, well, what about everybody else? What about the government? And despite having said that the government must be involved, I mean, I was appalled, frankly, by. We all talk about the CP, the Central Pollution Control Boards and the state pollution control boards, but frankly, these organizations, certainly to my experience, are not at all effective. In fact, I mean, going to the CPCB, which I rang them repeatedly and emailed them and I finally just went along there and just barged in the door and went to see somebody, and it was clearly just a hopeless institution where nobody was doing any real research. Nobody was, I mean, I don't think anyone was doing anything really. And I just thought, this is really depressing because there's a huge building on the outskirts of Delhi which has a massive task ahead of it, and it wasn't doing it, So, so somehow we need to bring together not just the few NGOs who are kind of despairing and have been interviewed by people like me for the last 50 years, one guy in Patna, one guy in Kanpur, somebody else in, everybody needs to get involved, and that involves, yes, communities, local governments, national governments, private sector. I don't know how to do it, and it's obviously a massive political and social question, but it is the big task that lies ahead of us for South Asia's rivers generally, I think. Yeah.
Thank you, Victor.
What a pleasure to hear from you, and if you want to hear more, get the book. One thing I should say, though, is that along the lines of the Sufi poetry and others, we are trying to collect, sort of poetry of the rivers. Martha has some, there's Sanskrit, there's, Tamil, etc. All the wonderful things, even Coleridge, we can have those poems of the river, or the artistic contributions. And the other thing we're trying to collect in one place is a bibliography of some of the things we already have mentioned, things that that we haven't put together, but we will have that so you can have a look at it and add to it. But thank you, Victor, for one great contribution. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, wonderful.